Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to you all. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, Education in a Time of Emergency, a curriculum for the Anthropocene. The world has experienced dramatic change these past few years, which were hit by a global pandemic, an ever-changing technology, and with a climate emergency bearing down on us. Further change is necessary and a given. Not only are legacy systems becoming outdated, but so too are ways of thinking and working, thus creating a challenge in preparing future generations for the transformations to come. This is where Black Mountains College comes in, with the goal of equipping students with new ways of thinking and working, so they can thrive in the modern world and help solve society's most pressing challenges. Today I'm pleased to be joined by Ben Rawlence, the founder and director of Black Mountains College. Ben is a writer, social scientist, and former advisor to political parties in the UK and Africa. His work includes Radio Congo, Signals of Hope from Africa's Deadliest War, published in 2012, City of Thorns, 9 Lives in the World's Largest Refugee Camp, published in 2016, and most recently, The Treeline, The Last Forest and the Future of Life on Earth, published earlier this year. As always, before we begin, some brief housekeeping points. I'm Charlotte Dawber-Ashley and I manage the FS Club here at ZN. And I'd like to warmly acknowledge our very generous sponsors who enable us to continue to bring you a wide range of thought-provoking content across finance, technology, economics, and education like today. The slides for this presentation are publicly available on our website and in the chat box. The session will also be recorded and available to watch on our website within 48 hours. And we'll also be holding a 20-minute Q&A after the presentation. So please use the GoToWebinar facility to send your questions in to me, and then I'll feed them into Ben. Now, the boring stuff is out of the way. Before I hand over to Ben, I have a question for you all. How important is the degree you studied for in the role where you currently work now? So very, you use that degree every day. Quite, you use it frequently. Not very, you rarely use it. And not at all, you never use it. It's quite an interesting question there, so I'm quite intrigued to see what people say. Just leave it up there a moment longer so everyone has a chance to answer that on their screens. Okay. Okay, so 36% of you use it frequently, and 21% use it every day, and 21% never use it, and 21% rarely use it. Thank you very much for answering that for us. Now I will welcome you to take the virtual floor, Ben.
Thank you, Charlotte, and good morning. Good morning from Wales. Good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for this invitation, and in particular to Michael Manelli for visiting the college earlier this year and inviting me to address this group. Could we have the first slide, please, Peter, after this one? Black Mountains College was founded in response to our current emergency in climate and nature. And you've heard the phrase, I'm sure, this changes everything, from the book by Naomi Klein. And indeed it does, because as many economists will tell you, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, and all of the underpinnings of our human systems, of course, rest on natural ones: food, water, natural resources, and all the rest of it. But this is very important for understanding the future and understanding, who we are and our relation to the planet, of course. It's not just an emergency, it's a new era. And what I mean by that is that there are two underlying assumptions which have changed the way I think about the future and have informed the founding of Black Mountains College. The first is that global warming and the global breakdown, climate breakdown that's been underway for the last 100 years will lead to significant, is already leading to significant irreversible changes. Even if we succeed in limiting warming below 2 degrees, which is increasingly unlikely, and although 1.5 is theoretically possible, nobody thinks it's going to happen. So this means we have to get used to significant irreversible changes in the way that our Earth functions, and that has huge impacts, huge implications for business as usual. The second assumption is that adaptation and mitigation imply each other. So as many of you will know, over the last couple of decades, there's been a certain amount of tension in the climate community and certainly in government between whether we should be trying to reduce emissions or whether we should be adapting to warming. And there was always this idea that adaptation was somehow giving up the candle and we should be focusing on mitigation instead. The harsh truth, of course, is that drought is already being experienced. There are sea level rises locked in. Food shocks are coming. We've already started to experience the sharp end of some of this year and last. And we're only going to see more of that. So both of these things are important, adaptation and mitigation at the same time. And both of them are, of course, the key elements of what's increasingly being called a just transition, a shift to a new way of life, to a new economic footing, to a new relationship with government, and new relationships, of course, between people and international institutions as well. So the next slide, please. That means those two things, that adaptation and mitigation being the key challenge for businesses, but also for individuals in the future, and getting used to those irreversible changes mean a lot of uncertainty. Now, there's a lot of forecasting out there. The IPCC is, of course, the central body that is responsible for that, and it's done a really good job of setting out the environmental impacts. We have a pretty good idea, and they've been pretty consistent over the last 30, 40 years in predicting the curve and in predicting all of the impacts that warming will bring. There is a certain amount of uncertainty in the Earth system response now, because we're getting close to tipping points. We may already have surpassed particular tipping points, and therefore the impacts that flow from that are a lot more uneven. They're non-linear. In particular, ice sheet collapse. The latest research from Greenland suggests that the ice sheet is now gone, and it's just a question of time. So that creates a certain amount of more uncertainty around the environmental impacts. But what's even more uncertain is the human responses. So environmental science has been actually much more robust in a way than political science, and certainly economics and social science. Is very hard to predict how those human systems are going to respond to collapsing ecosystems. So that's the sort of the uncertain context of the next couple of decades. Indeed, the next, I would say, 6, 7, 8 decades till the end of the century. And I think we know for sure that the world will be less habitable, not uninhabitable, and therefore we'll be coping with a lot more instability, migration, inequality, and I think, in particular, a lot of economic uncertainty there as well. What that means for how we plan and how we think and how we operate in those coming decades is going to be a lot about climate justice, a lot about loss and damage, of course, because there's going to be movement of people. There's going to be a lot of international pressure and tension amongst the big polluters and those who are on the front line, which are often not the same people. So this is a very big challenge for the future, but for education in general, because education is broadly concerned with preparing people for the future. It's about transmitting culture and skills to the next generation. But if that future bears very little resemblance to the past, then what are we transmitting? So we need new ways of thinking about ourselves, about nature, and about our place in the world. And that's what Black Mountains College was founded to do. Next slide, please. So this poses the question, what kinds of skills are needed in that very uncertain future? How do we navigate uncertainty? And this, in a way, gets to the question at the beginning, because a poll, I think, a couple of years ago from the Association of UK Graduate Recruiters found that 92% of them didn't mind what you studied at university. There was very little focus on the subject. What they focused on was the skills: communication, collaboration, critical thinking, creativity, initiative, things like this. Those are the things that employers said they were broadly looking for. And to a large extent, those skills are, are enduring. Those are the things that people will need to navigate uncertainty in the future. And what we believe is that every job will be a climate job. Project Drawdown has an awful lot of really good data on this if you're interested in looking at that further. There will be practical future skills that are required in terms of the new and the old trades that we currently have. So where we get our energy from, our food, how we build our houses, transport, water infrastructure, and timber. Those practical future skills are going to be critical, where we can no longer rely on global supply chains for a lot of those things. The other future skill, the other side of those future skills that we think are going to be necessary are critical future skills. So those are some of the things I spoke about in terms of analysis, critical thinking, collaboration, creativity. We need new kinds of graduates. And that's not just us who are saying that. That's the CBI, the OECD, the World Economic Forum, and the UK government Green Skills Report. A lot of those, the skills that are highlighted there are not things that universities traditionally teach. For example, empathy was highlighted by the FT as one of those. So this is not about green skills in a technologically oriented economy. This is really about adaptation, holistic adaptation to a finite world, so a world with finite resources. So growth is not holistic, and limits to growth are, we're already seeing hard limits to growth in environmental terms. But what that means for how businesses need to respond, and actually the role that they're playing in the society and the economy, is also going to shift, and indeed is already shifting. Next slide, please, Peter. So BMC aims to meet some of those skills needs through 3 different strands. We run short courses for a range of different people, from counsellors to corporates to community days. We do vocational training in those future skills, particularly focusing in the first instance on horticulture, on growing food locally, because local food systems are going to be a key part of responding to food shocks. And the other focus we've started with is coppicing, which is forestry, but traditional forestry. And the hills in Wales that I'm looking out the window at here are full of derelict coppice woodlands that used to be coppiced and produced all of our domestic fuel and timber needs, but of course these days haven't been cut properly for 100 years. So bringing those back into production, especially with the focus on tree planting in the UK, is going to be a key skill going forwards. And the last thing that we do is a new degree called Sustainable Futures in Arts, Ecology and Systems Change. And that really gets to the heart of these, what some people call soft skills, what I think I would call core skills that anybody needs if they're going to be an effective graduate working for an employer, or indeed going on to higher education and research. Next slide, please. This is where we are in Wales, in a hill farm in the Brecon Beacons National Park. Carry on, please, Peter. And I'm just going to say a little bit more about this degree program and the heart of this, what I call curriculum for the Anthropocene, which is this unique program with a unique form of delivery, all driven by the science. So most universities employ lecture theatres, some use seminars, but the educational setting that most accurately reflects the up-to-date neuroscience and educational psychology of how people learn is actually primary schools, because we know from neuroscience that humans learn best through play, outdoors, in small groups, in applied settings, using their whole body with all of their senses. And we've known this for decades already. This is not groundbreaking neuroscience, and yet so few educational settings actually follow that science in how they teach. So interestingly, in response to that poll at the beginning, many of you may find that you use skills of writing or presentation or critical thinking, but possibly those weren't the skills that wasn't the name of the degree. The name of the degree might have been classics or English or economics or something else. And the skills were almost a byproduct. Whereas actually, if you focused on teaching those things specifically, you may have that may well argue for a much more focused and effective and efficient way of teaching those skills. So firstly, we're driven by the neuroscience of how people learn. Secondly, we're driven by the environmental science of where we are. And that means a very hard and unflinching reckoning with those IPCC impact reports. And what I mean by that is the fact that, we're not going to get to 1.5 degrees, we're probably not going to get to 2 degrees. And in fact, the poll of Nature authors, the authors of the IPCC reports conducted by Nature, suggests that most of the majority of IPCC authors believe we will be at 3 degrees by the end of the century. Now, 3 degrees is a world in which the surface of the planet is remade. It's unrecognizable from where we are at the moment. It means, for example, that the whole of the landscape of the UK would be covered in invasive species, and many of our existing ecosystems would be unable to adapt. Humans would struggle to adapt in large parts of the world. We would have at least 3 billion people displaced. We would have many meters of sea level rise surging in. We would have drought on a rolling basis. We'd have food shocks. We'd have food system collapse, and all sorts of related economic problems and collapse as a result. Now, if that is the future that we're looking at within 60, 70 years, and a career habitually is from roughly 20 to roughly 60, 70, we're actually looking at an extraordinary amount of change over the lifetime or the career of somebody who's at university at the moment. So those, reckoning with that hard environmental science, and even if we manage to keep things, a little bit away from 3 degrees, we're still looking at a tremendous amount of upheaval. So reckoning with that environmental science then implies that we need to look to social and political science for how we cope with that. And that's where the systems change comes in. That's where we need to be thinking about theories of change. We need to be thinking about how humans organize, how democracies function, how international relations work, and how nation states and systems can find agreement and can find operating systems that allow them to function, because all of those systems are going to be under incredible stress. So thinking through that political economy, finding your own role within it, where do you want to play a role? What are you good at? How do you see these systems breaking down or transforming, and where can you align yourself and your job within that? And we also teach that in short courses for people thinking about those questions over the next couple of decades. This is not just for graduates thinking about 50 years into the future, because we're starting to see that process already evolving now. Next slide, please. This is the previous picture was the farm as it is now. This is the plans that we have for developing our campus. We're looking at a total raise of about 10 million, and the first is phase 1 is around 3, and we are in the process of finalizing an equity and debt round for that to underwrite facilities for that degree program. We are currently running short courses at the farm and in other locations here at Hay Castle and in the Brecon Beacons National Park. And the undergraduate program will be taking off in some parts of the farm and other associated venues here in Wales. It's the UK's first, I think it's fair to say, climate adaptation degree, and we are the first educational institution solely devoted to climate action and adaptation in the UK. Next slide, please. So there's a number of ways in which we think this particular methodology, this approach, can be deployed, both at the degree level. We do elements of this in the further education core skills training for our NVQ students, and we also offer compressed versions of that methodology around neuroscience, environmental science, and political economy in short courses and corporate trainings and retreats. This is just sort of for your information, but there's a range of ways in which companies and individuals can get involved. We're always looking for partners to host students and to set live briefs and challenges for our students. We have a climate careers fair every spring, where students come together with employers to explore what the future might look like in different sectors. We have an ecological futures camp for young people from urban settings to bring them to the national park and consider scenario planning. Last year that was sponsored by Welsh Water, and we're looking to run more of those next year with other sponsors next year. We're always looking for sponsors to sponsor undergraduate places. Some of our supporters are, of course, looking at SROI and sustainability impact, and we do bespoke training as well. So those are some of the ways you might like to get involved if what I've said resonates. And I think there's one more slide. Those are two websites. The top one is our prospectus for our degree program. And we want to be training 20 leaders next September, or welcoming 20 undergraduates next September who in 3 years' time will be future leaders. And hopefully working with some of you in your organizations. These will be, we hope, highly capable humans who have climate and ecological literacy in their bones, and who can help plan to pivot organizations and systems in record time so that they can adapt to these coming changes. So in sum, that's really what we think the future looks like in terms of skills, and our contribution to that, which is an innovation on higher education, and hopefully pioneering a new way of teaching and learning for the UK, but also for students from abroad. We'll be welcoming internationals as well. Hopefully that's left us enough time for questions. So I'll pass over to Charlotte to field those.
Thanks, Ben. That was a really fascinating presentation. It looks like such a beautiful, inspiring place to study, quite different to the lecture halls I was in at university. So we do have some really interesting questions coming in. Please do keep sending them and using the chat facility. So to kick things off, I have a question here from, sorry, let me just load this up. Right, so Hugh Purser has said, education is longer term, but how can we inject a sense of urgency into this process? And then a second part of that question is, are politicians not the first who need to be educated?
I would agree with that, yes. So that's why we are a mission-oriented institution with undergraduate and vocational training, but also short courses. So we're not a university, we're not an FE college, and we're not a retreat centre, but we're all of those things. And we're very much hoping that the short courses can be expanded to increase that training in action and adaptation across the board. So we did actually train politicians last year. We did a session with councillors, and we were overwhelmed. We had an incredible take-up, and we're hoping to do more of those next year, because to some extent I think the national scene is in a way too skewed and too corrupt. just because of the lobbying interests that are there, whereas at the local government level, you've got a bit more scope. Having said that, I think the politicians are also very much driven by the interests of different industries. So we're also focusing on corporates. We're hoping to have different adaptation courses for different sectors. So one with bankers, one with counsellors, one with lawyers, another with planning officers. So if that might be of interest, then please do get in touch, or just keep a lookout for things that we'll be offering.
That's very promising to hear. Okay, so Keith Robertson has said, it's hard to believe future challenges can be met without a reduction ultimately in global human population. Have you given thought to the size of population necessary for environmental stability? And does that necessarily mean the end of economic, scientific, and technological growth?
My response on the population question is that it's about distribution. So it's not, we could feed the current population, and we could ensure adequate standard of living for everybody if there was a much more radical redistribution of resources. So, and that's really why I put that climate justice question at the top. The coming political struggle is going to be about distribution. It's going to be about distribution of land, distribution of money, and also power and control. And that's always been the case, but we've managed to avoid large-scale conflict over those things so far, well, at least in my lifetime since World War II, because of broadly an abundance of those things, particularly in Europe and some of the more sort of middle-income places. But where that breaks down, of course, then you have got war. So I think there's a strong argument for underlying climate-driven conflict in the Horn of Africa, in Yemen, Bangladesh, on the border with Myanmar, and those sorts of things. So I would say I don't think population is it is necessarily the only of course it's a factor, but I don't think it's going to be the key thing. There will be, I'm sure there'll be plenty of right-wing pressure to push overpopulation to the top of the agenda, but I think it's much harder to control that. It's much easier to control the distribution side of things.
Indeed. Peter Cousins has said, I'm surprised you haven't mentioned the role of scientific skills in adapting to climate change. We already have gene editing technology to produce drought and flood-resistant plants, new renewable energy fuels, etc. But the green movement has often been anti-science. Surely we need to be training more highly skilled scientists as much as the skills you are talking about.
I would agree. Yes, there is a role for technology. One of our pathways in year 2 does focus on technology. I think the point about our intervention here at the undergraduate level is really taking the lead from the US approach to undergraduate study, which is as a kind of broad grounding, a broad holistic grounding in certain kinds of literacy. And we will teach the scientific method and basic scientific skills, which you may then go on to study further at graduate level. But a lot of those innovations, I mean, particularly, again, the focus on vocational skills is around implementing innovations which already exist: heat pumps, solar panels, all of those, domestic products which are there already, but which are not being implemented at scale because in many cases there's a lack of installers, and then of course there's the regulatory framework which incentivizes people in the wrong way. So I agree with you in the sense that a lot of interventions are needed all the way along the system, and our contribution here is a radical kind of undergraduate training that can give a broad grounding, which we hope will be relevant and applicable across the board.
You mentioned how sort of at the primary school level, it's all catered towards how people learn in terms of the neuro pathways and things, but it seems that dramatically changes when you get to high school and then further on to higher education. So it seems like there could be a lot of scope to change the way, you know, people are taught at high school before they go into work, and especially those who don't go on to higher education as well.
Yes, in terms of the skills agenda, I think we've seen a kind of, in a way, it's like kids go into a funnel and then they come out the other end, and they're progressively told to reduce their choices. So you reduce your choices at GCSE, you reduce your choices further at A level, and then you reduce them again at degree level. And that's precisely the opposite of what we need, actually. And I think this was always the case, but it's increasingly important and urgent and relevant at the time of planetary crisis. But it was always the case that actually, you know, really successful people, polymaths, who can make connections across and see patterns in lots of different areas, are those who, you know, are on the one hand musicians and physicists, you know, in the daytime. Or who can write, but also who can, you know, who can make things. So that, you know, re-engineering education has been a struggle for many years, but it's a struggle really against the inertia of government central planners who are obsessed with skills which had broken down into increasingly smaller metrics. So it's the sort of the triumph of the econometric approach, if you like, to measuring human capital and trying to put a number on everything and a certain number of skills in a certain number of areas and sectors. And this kind of overemphasis on specialization really, I think, has its roots in the Industrial Revolution and the idea of particular roles for which you train particular people. And actually, if we need a much more holistic idea of what humans are. And broadly speaking, those are the innovators. It's the, you know, it's often the, you know, the artists and the entrepreneurs who buck the trend, who often dropped out of school or who looked at things differently. You know, those are the people who are manifestly not the cog in the wheel. So I think the argument holds both for kind of entrepreneurship and innovation as much as it does for improvisation and resilience in a time of you know, of upheaval. So those sort of core skills, I think, are and how to promote them should always be part of the conversation and should always be the focus of anybody seeking to get better outcomes from kind of very mechanized educational systems.
I like how you refer to them as core skills as well, not soft skills, because they really are essential, not just a nice to have, aren't they? And I think with my education, I never heard the concept of being told to think creatively and think critically until I had left the public education system and was in university. So they need to be taught much earlier. But it looks like we've come to the end of time for today. So thank you very much. It's been a really interesting, worthwhile conversation. And also, once again, thanks to our wonderful sponsors for making these webinars possible, I should say. And equally important, thank you to our inquisitive and intelligent audience for your time and contributions today. And also, don't forget to check out our forthcoming events on our website. As always, we have a wide variety of topics coming up, from why employee share ownership matters tomorrow, to the topical lunatics and unstable coins, forging effective regulatory swords and shields. And that one's on Thursday for you all. So I'll see you again soon, and thank you very much. Take care. Bye.